All right, hello and welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with yet another installment in Chapter 11, which is of the rent of land. Today we'll be beginning we'll probably be able to finish too, the penultimate subsection, which is conclusion of the digression concerning the variations in the value of silver, all within Part 3 of Chapter 11, Part 3 entitled of the variations in the proportion between the respective values of that sort of produce which always affords rent, and of that which sometimes does and sometimes does not afford rent. So yes, we are still in the middle of that slog, which is the history of silver, the history of the price of silver in England through 1776. So yes, I will link to the next video, probably either after this one or the one after that, that will get us through this slog if you're not interested. But without further ado, the greater part of the writers who have collected the money prices of things in ancient times seem to have considered the low money price of corn and of goods in general, or, in other words, the high value of gold and silver, as a proof not only of the scarcity of those metals, but of the poverty and barbarism of the country at the time when it took place. This notion is connected with the system of political economy which represents national wealth as consisting in the abundance and national poverty in the scarcity of gold and silver, a system which I shall endeavor to explain and examine at great length in the fourth book of this inquiry. I shall only observe at present that the high value of the precious metals can be no proof of the poverty or barbarism of any particular country at the time when it took place. It is a proof only of the barrenness of the mines which happened at the time to supply the commercial world. A poor country, as it cannot afford to buy more, so it can as little afford to pay dearer for gold and silver than a rich one, and the value of those metals, therefore, is not likely to be higher in the former than in the latter. In China, a country much richer than any part of Europe, the value of the precious metals is much higher than in any part of Europe. As the wealth of Europe, indeed, has increased greatly since the discovery of the mines of America, so the value of gold and silver has gradually diminished. This diminution of their value, however, has not been owing to the increase of the real wealth of Europe, of the annual produce of its land and labor, but the accidental discovery of more abundant mines than any that were known before. The increase of the quantity of gold and silver in Europe and the increase of its manufactures and agriculture are two events which, though they have happened nearly about the same time, yet have arisen from very different causes, and have scarce any natural connection with one another. The one has arisen from a mere accident, in which neither produce nor policy either had or could have any share. The other from the fall of the feudal system, and from the establishment of a government which afforded to industry the only encouragement which it requires, some tolerable security that it shall enjoy the fruits of its own labor. Poland, where the feudal system still continues to take place, is at this day as beggarly a country as it was before the discovery of America. The money price of corn, however, has risen. The real value of the precious metals has fallen in Poland in the same manner as in other parts of Europe. Their quantity, therefore, must have increased there as in other places, and nearly in the same proportion to the annual produce of its land and labor. This increase of the quantity of those metals, however, has not, it seems, increased that annual produce, has neither improved the manufactures and agriculture of the country, nor mended the circumstances of its inhabitants. Spain and Portugal, the countries which possess the mines, are after Poland perhaps the two most beggarly countries in Europe. The value of the precious metals, however, must be lower in Spain and Portugal than in any other part of Europe, as they come from those countries to all other parts of Europe, loaded not only with a freight and an insurance, but with the expense of smuggling, their exportation being either prohibited or subjected to a duty. In proportion to the annual produce of the land and of the land and labor, therefore, their quantity must be greater in those countries than in any other part of Europe. Those countries, however, are poorer than the greater part of Europe. Though the feudal system has been abolished in Spain and Portugal, it has not been succeeded by a much better. As the low value of gold and silver, therefore, is no proof of the wealth and flourishing state of the country where it takes place, so neither is their high value or the low money price either of goods in general or of corn in particular any proof of its poverty and barbarism. But though the low money price either of goods in general or of corn in particular be no proof of the poverty or barbarism of the times, the low money price of some particular sorts of goods, such as cattle, poultry, games of all kinds, etc., in proportion to that of corn, is a most decisive one. It clearly demonstrates, first, their great abundance in proportion to that of corn, and consequently to the great extent of the land which they occupied in proportion to what was occupied by corn. And, secondly, the low value of this land in proportion to that of corn land, and consequently the uncultivated and unimproved state of the far greater part of the lands of the country. It clearly demonstrates that the stock and population of the country did not bear the same proportion to the extent of its country, which they commonly do in civilized countries, and that society was at that time, and in that country, but in its infancy. From the high or low money price either of goods in general, or of corn in particular, we can infer only that the mines which at that time happened to supply the commercial world with gold and silver were fertile or barren, not that the country was rich or poor. But from the high or low money price of some sorts of goods in proportion to that of others, we can infer, with a degree of probability that approaches almost to certainty, that it was rich or poor, that the greater part of its lands were improved or unimproved, and that it was either in a more or less barbarous state, or in a more or less civilized one. Any rise in the money price of goods, which proceeded altogether from the degradation of the value of silver, would affect all sorts of goods equally, and raise their price universally a third, or a fourth, or a fifth part higher, according as silver happened to lose a third, or a fourth, or a fifth part of its former value. But the rise in the price of provisions, which has been the subject of so much reasoning and conversation, does not affect all sorts of provisions equally. Taking the course of the present century at an average, the price of corn, it is acknowledged, even by those who account for the rise by the degradation of the value of silver, has risen much less than that of some other sorts of provisions. The rise in the price of those other sorts of provisions, therefore, cannot be owing altogether to the degradation of the value of silver. Some other causes must be taken into the account, and those which have been above assigned will, perhaps, without having recourse to the supposed degradation of the value of silver, sufficiently explain this rise in those particular sorts of provisions of which the price has actually risen in proportion to that of corn. As to the price of corn itself, it has, during the 64 first years of the present century, and before the late extraordinary course of bad seasons, been somewhat lower than it was during the 64 last years of the preceding century. This fact is attested not only by the accounts of Windsor Market, but of public fires of all different countries of Scotland, and by the accounts of several different markets in France, which have been collected with great diligence and fidelity by Mr. Messens and by Mr. Debré de Semoir. The evidence is more complete than could well have been expected in a matter which is naturally so very difficult to be ascertained. As to the high price of corn during these last 10 or 12 years, it can be sufficiently accounted for from the badness of the seasons, without supposing any degradation in the value of silver. The opinion, therefore, that silver is continually sinking in its value seems not to be founded upon any good observations, either upon the prices of corn or upon those of other provisions. The same quantity of silver, it may perhaps be said, will in the present times, even according to the account which has been here given, purchase a much smaller quantity of several sorts of provisions than it would have during some part of the last century. And to ascertain whether this change be owing to a rise in the value of those goods, or to a fall in the value of silver, is only to establish a vain and useless distinction, which can be of no sort of service to the man who has only a certain quantity of silver to go to market with, or a certain fixed revenue in money. I certainly do not pretend that the knowledge of this distinction will enable him to buy cheaper. It may not, however, upon that account be altogether useless. It may be of some use to the public by affording an easy proof of the prosperous condition of the country. If the rise in the price of some sorts of provisions be owing altogether to a fall in the value of silver, it is owing to a circumstance from which nothing can be inferred but the fertility of the American mines. The real wealth of the country, the annual produce of its land and labor, may, notwithstanding the circumstance, be either gradually declining, as in Portugal and Poland, or gradually advancing, as in most other parts of Europe. But if this rise in the price of some sorts of provisions be owing to a rise in the real value of the land which produces them, to its increased fertility, or, in consequence of more extended improvement in cultivation, to its having been rendered fit for producing corn, it is owing to a circumstance which indicates in the clearest manner the prosperous and advancing state of the country. The land constitutes by far the greatest, the most important, and the most durable part of the wealth of every extensive country. It may surely be of some use, or, at least, it may give some satisfaction to the public to have so decisive a proof of the increasing value of by far the greatest, the most important, and the most durable part of its wealth. It may, too, be of some use to the public in regulating the pecuniary reward of some of its inferior servants. If this rise in the price of some sorts of provisions be owing to a fall in the value of silver, their pecuniary reward, provided it was not too large before, ought certainly to be augmented in proportion to the extent of this fall. If it is not augmented, their real recompense will evidently be so much diminished. But if this rise of price is owing to the increased value in consequence of the improved fertility of the land which produces such provisions, it becomes a much nicer matter to judge either in what proportion any pecuniary reward ought to be augmented, or whether it ought to be augmented at all. The extension of improvement in cultivation, as it necessarily raises more or less in proportion to the price of corn, that every sort of animal food, so it as necessarily lowers that of, I believe, every sort of vegetable food. It raises the price of animal food because a great part of the land which produces it, being rendered fit for producing corn, must afford to the landlord and farmer the rent and profit of corn land. It lowers the price of vegetable food because, by increasing the fertility of the land, it increases its abundance. The improvements of agriculture, too, introduce many sorts of vegetable food, which, requiring less land and not much more labor than corn, come much cheaper to market. Such are potatoes and maize, or what is called Indian corn, the two most important improvements which the agriculture of Europe, perhaps which Europe itself, has received from the great extension of its commerce and navigation. Many sorts of vegetable food, besides, which in the rude state of agriculture are confined to the kitchen garden, and raised only by the spade, come in its improved state to be introduced into common fields, and to be raised by the plough, such as turnips, carrots, cabbages, etc. If in the progress of improvement, therefore, the real price of one species of food necessarily rises, that of another as necessarily falls, and it becomes a matter of more nicety to judge how far the rise in one may be compensated by the fall in the other. When the real price of butcher's meat has once got to its height, which, with regard to every sort, except perhaps that of hog flesh, it seems to have done through a great part of England more than a century ago, any rise which can afterwards happen in that of any other sort of animal food cannot much affect the circumstances of the inferior ranks of people. The circumstances of the poor through a great part of England cannot surely be so much distressed by any rise in the price of poultry, fish, wildfowl, or venison, as they must be relieved by the fall in that of potatoes. In the present season of scarcity, the high price of corn no doubt distresses the poor. But in times of moderate plenty, when corn is at its ordinary or average price, the natural rise in the price of any other sort of rude produce cannot much affect them. They suffer more, perhaps, by the artificial rise which has been occasioned by taxes in the price of some manufactured commodities, as of salt, soap, leather, candles, malt, beer, and ale, etc. Okay, that ends that subsection. We're about 16 minutes in, so we can continue on to the next section. The next subsection, which I believe is now truly the penultimate section, is entitled Effects of the Progress of Improvement upon the Real Price of Manufactures. So let's begin. It is the natural effect of improvement, however, to diminish gradually the real price of almost all manufactures. That of the manufacturing workshop diminishes, perhaps in all of them without exception. In consequence of better machinery, of greater dexterity, and of a more proper division and distribution of work, all of which are the natural effects of improvement, a much smaller quantity of labor becomes requisite for executing any particular piece of work, and, though in consequence of the flourishing circumstances of the society, the real price of labor should rise very considerably, yet the great diminution of the quantity will generally much more than compensate the greatest rise which can happen in the price. There are, indeed, a few manufactures in which the necessary rise in the real price of the rude materials will more than compensate all the advantages which improvement can introduce into the execution of the work. In carpenters' and joiners' work, and in the coarser sort of cabinet work, the necessary rise in the real price of barren timber, and consequence of the improvement of land, will more than compensate all the advantages which can be derived from the best machinery, the greatest dexterity, and the most proper division and distribution of work. But in all cases in which the real price of the rude materials either does not rise at all, or does not rise very much, that of the manufactured commodities sinks very considerably. This diminution of price has, in the course of the present and preceding century, been most remarkable in those manufactures of which the materials are the coarser metals. A better movement of a watch, that about the middle of the last century could have been bought for £20, may now perhaps be had for 20 shillings. In the work of cutlers and locksmiths, in all the toys which are made of the coarser metals, and in all those goods which are commonly known by the name of Birmingham and Sheffield ware, there has been, during the same period, a very great reduction of price, though not altogether so great as in watchwork. It has, however, been sufficient to astonish the workmen of every other part of Europe, who in many cases acknowledge that they can produce no work of equal goodness for double or even triple the price. There are perhaps no manufactures in which the division of labor can be carried further, or in which the machinery employed admits of a greater variety of improvements than those of which the materials are the coarser metals. In the clothing manufacture there has, during the same period, been no such sensible reduction of price. The price of superfine cloth, I have been assured, on the contrary, has, within these 25 or 30 years, risen somewhat in proportion to its quality, owing, it was said, to a considerable rise in the price of the material, which consists altogether of Spanish wool. That of the Yorkshire cloth, which is made altogether of English wool, is said, indeed, during the course of the present century, to have fallen a good deal in proportion to its quality. Quality, however, is so very disputable a matter that I look upon all information of this kind as somewhat uncertain. In the clothing manufacture, the division of labor is nearly the same now as it was a century ago, and the machinery employed is not very different. There may, however, have been some small improvements in both, which may have occasioned some reduction of price. But the reduction will appear much more sensible and undeniable if we compare the price of this manufacture in the present times with what it was in a much remoter period, towards the end of the 15th century, when the labor was probably much less subdivided and the machinery employed much more imperfect than it is at present. In 1487, being the 4th of Henry VII, it was enacted that, quote, whosoever shall sell by retail a broad yard of the finest scarlet grained or of other grained cloth of the finest making above 16 shillings shall forfeit 40 shillings for every yard so sold. End quote. 16 shillings, therefore, containing about the same quantity of silver as 4 and 20 shillings of our present money, was, at the time, reckoned not an unreasonable price for a yard of the finest cloth. And as this is a sumptuary law, such cloth, it is probable, had usually been sold somewhat dearer. A guinea may be reckoned the highest price in the present times. Even though the quality of the cloths, therefore, should be supposed equal, and that of the present times it is most probably much superior, yet, even upon this supposition, the money price of the finest cloth appears to have been considerably reduced since the end of the 15th century. But its real price has been much more reduced. 6 shillings and 8 pence was then, and long afterwards, reckoned the average price of a quarter of wheat. 16 shillings, therefore, was the price of 2 quarters and more than 3 bushels of wheat. Valuing a quarter of wheat in the present times at 8 and 20 shillings, the real price of a yard of fine cloth must, in those times, have been equal to at least 3 pounds 6 shillings and 6 pence of our present money. The man who bought it must have parted with the command of a quantity of labor and subsistence equal to what that sum would purchase in the present times. The reduction in the real price of the coarse manufacture, though considerable, has not been so great as in that of the fine. In 1463, being the 3rd of Edward IV, was enacted that no servant in husbandry, nor common laborer, nor servant to any artificer inhabiting out of a city or burgh, shall use or wear in their clothing any cloth above 2 shillings the broad yard. In the 3rd of Edward IV, 2 shillings contained very nearly the same quantity of silver as 4 of our present money. But the Yorkshire cloth, which is now sold at 4 shillings the yard, is probably much superior to any that was then made for the wearing of the very poorest order of common servants. Even the money price of their clothing, therefore, may, in proportion to the quality, be somewhat cheaper in the present than it was in those ancient times. The real price is certainly a good deal cheaper. 10 pence was then reckoned what is called the moderate and reasonable price of a bushel of wheat. 2 shillings, therefore, was the price of 2 bushels and near 2 pecks of wheat, which in the present times, at 3 shillings and 6 pence a bushel, will be worth 8 shillings and 9 pence. For a yard of this cloth, the poor servant must have parted with the power of purchasing a quantity of subsistence equal to what 8 shillings and 9 pence would purchase in the present times. This is a sumptuary law, too, restraining the luxury and extravagances of the poor. Their clothing, therefore, had commonly been much more expensive. The same order of people are, by the same law, prohibited from wearing hose, of which the price should exceed 14 pence the pair, equal to about 8 and 20 pence of our present money. But 14 pence was in those times the price of a bushel and near 2 pecks of wheat, which in the present times, at 3 and 6 pence a bushel, would cost 5 shillings and 3 pence. We should, in the present times, consider this as a very high price for a pair of stockings to a servant of the poorest and lowest order. He must, however, in those times have paid what was really equivalent to this price for them. In the time of Edward IV, the art of knitting stockings was probably not known in any part of Europe. Their hose were made of common cloth, which may have been one of the causes of their dearness. The first person that wore stockings in England is said to have been Queen Elizabeth. She received them as a present from the Spanish ambassador. But in the coarse and in the fine woolen manufacture, the machinery employed was much more imperfect in those ancient than it is in the present times. It has since received 3 very capital improvements, besides probably many smaller ones, of which it may be difficult to ascertain either the number or the importance. The 3 capital improvements are, first, the exchange of the rock and spindle for the spinning wheel, which, with the same quantity of labor, will perform more than double the quantity of work. Secondly, the use of several very ingenious machines which facilitate and abridge in a still greater proportion the winding of the worsted and woolen yarn, or the proper arrangement of the warp and woof before they are put into the loom, an operation which, previous to the inventions of those machines, must have been extremely tedious and troublesome. Thirdly, the employment of the fulling mill for thickening the cloth instead of treading it in water. Neither wind nor water mills of any kind were known in England so early as the beginning of the 16th century, nor, as far as I know, in any other part of Europe north of the Alps. They had been introduced into Italy some time before. The consideration of these circumstances may, perhaps, in some measure explain to us why the real price both of the coarse and of fine manufacture was so much higher in those ancient than it is in the present times. It cost a great quantity of labor to bring the goods to market. When they were brought thither, therefore, they must have purchased or exchanged for the price of a greater quantity. The course of manufacture probably was, in those ancient times, carried on in England in the same manner as it always has been in countries where arts and manufactures are in their infancy. It was probably a household manufacture in which every different part of the work was occasionally performed by all the different members of almost every private family. But so as to be their work only when they had nothing else to do, and not to be the principal business from which any of them derived the greater part of their subsistence. The work which is performed in this manner, it has already been observed, comes always much cheaper to market than that which is the principal or sole fund of the workman's subsistence. The fine manufacture, on the other hand, was not in those times carried on in England, but in the rich and commercial country of Flanders, and it was probably conducted then in the same manner as now, by people who derived the whole or the principal part of their subsistence from it. It was besides a foreign manufacture, and most have paid some duty, the ancient custom of tonnage and poundage at least, to the king. This duty, indeed, would not probably be very great. It was not then the policy of Europe to restrain, by high duties, the importation of foreign manufactures, but rather to encourage it in order that merchants might be enabled to supply, at as easy a rate as possible, the great men with the conveniencies and luxuries which they wanted, and which the industry of their own country could not afford them. The consideration of these circumstances may perhaps in some measure explain to us why, in those ancient times, the real price of the coarse manufacture was, in proportion to that of the fine, so much lower than in the present times. All right, that concludes that penultimate subsection. In our next read, we will continue with Chapter 11 with the conclusion of the chapter, the subsection entitled Conclusion of the Chapter. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.